From Southern Hospitality on Manhattan's Upper East Side, I'm Mark Hale for NYPost.com. We're going to be talking Yankees today with my friend and teammate, our great baseball columnist, Joel Sherman. And Joel, we'll welcome you in right now. And let's talk about the fact that 1/3 of the season is done. We've still got about 110 games to go. And maybe the most important Yankee the rest of the way, in your opinion, is Phil Hughes.
Well, obviously, it's hard to make the case that he's the most important when there's other guys playing. And the most important player on the team is CC Sabathia. He's absolutely irreplaceable. But because of who the other four starters are and what the Yankees' ultimate needs might be, I think you have to make a case that Phil Hughes is going to be a vital player if he could get back to last year. And I would make that case for two reasons. The four people behind CC Sabathia are three starters who are 34 and older: Bartolo Colon, A.J. Burnett, and Freddie Garcia. The Yankees are the only team in baseball to have three starting pitchers 34 or older. There's only 16 in the whole sport who have made at least 8 starts, and the Yankees have 3 of them. And the other starter is a kid, Ivan Nova, who on some occasions shows promise and on some occasions suggests that he still has a lot of growing pains, which is natural for a young pitcher. He's a rookie, but the Yankees have aspirations of being something special. And the idea that those 4 guys are going to make it round and round, considering their age and or their inexperience for the rest of the season, is very unlikely. I, in fact, would say it's pretty much impossible.
Right.
And so at some point, the Yankees are going to have to add a starter. And they like people at AAA like David Phelps or Adam Warren, but they actually have a guy on the roster who won 18 games last year, 17 as a starter, in Phil Hughes. And so he absolutely would be the ideal guy, especially because, Mark, and look, 60 days is a long time. But we're 60 days from the trade deadline, and it is very, very difficult to see where the Yankees would add a starting pitcher into the American League East that's anything better than a number 3 at the most or a number 4. And, again, they have Phil Hughes, and he could be at least that, if not better, if he's fully formed. And Mark, I think you got to take the reality possibility after seeing a third of the season that the Yankees just have a lot of dead spots in the lineup, and that their big trade in July, where they might have to use their pieces, might have to be on a position player, perhaps a right fielder or a corner outfielder, perhaps on someone who can be a DH/player in the field someplace. But that combination to me suggests that their best answer to just having the most assets moving forward is they really need Phil Hughes to get better and be a performer for them, for even if it's just for the second half of the season.
Joel, how do the Yankees balance, Hughes' importance to this team and Hughes' value to this team with also, the fact that right now they're dealing with Bartolo Colon, who we don't know how much longer he's going to be able to pitch at this level. They are going to need that other bat, but then they might have Hughes coming back as well. So how do they balance, let's say, potentially a Hughes and Colon tandem, which could be pretty formidable, but there's also a decent chance that neither one of them will be able to pitch effectively the rest of the season?
Look, Mark, I think there always has to be a certain amount of blind faith a team has. You obviously try to plan for as many different contingencies as possible, but the reality is if too many problems hit, then even a team loaded with assets, both in the minor leagues, in the major leagues, and of course financially, like the Yankees, you can't overcome them all. And, that's why I said is, with everything the Yankees have coming for them, imagine if CC Sabathia were hurt. It's pretty much game over. You might start playing for 2012. So, you kind of need a fair amount of fortune in that realm. So, you got to have blind faith. Can the Yankees have blind faith in Bartolo Colon? No. But, like in your mind, can you imagine kind of getting 15, 18 starts out of Colon and then having some kind of tag team to the end where Phil Hughes is the guy who takes the baton? That would be probably better than most teams will be able to trade for at some point. Whoever the trade turns out to be, Brett Myers, Francisco Liriano, I would take a healthy, fully formed, Phil Hughes over that group. And, like the other thing I would think about with Bartolo Colon is, the Yankees are a team that has aspirations of playing in the postseason. And at that point, you're not just talking 30 starts, you're talking 32, 30, depending on how far you go. And my suspicion is a guy like Bartolo Colon is going to need a pit stop someplace along the way if you actually expect him to be effective in September and October. And again, who would you like allowing him to make that pit stop? Again, the Yankees like Adam Warren. They like David Phelps. But do you want some kid who's never pitched in the major leagues to step into July and August in the American League East, or do you want Phil Hughes to do it?
Joel, you mentioned a guy like Brett Myers, you mentioned a guy like Francisco Liriano. In your mind, or is that pretty much, probably the elite pitchers who are available before this trade deadline on July 31st?
Mark, I think if you and I were having this conversation exactly a year ago today, we probably wouldn't have said that Cliff Lee, Roy Oswalt, and Dan Harron would be traded 2 months later before the July 31st deadline. And that actually did happen. There have been a lot of high-end starting pitchers traded over the last few years. So the idea of kind of like putting your foot down and saying, no way will a good pitcher get out in the market is probably folly. On the other hand, sitting here today and seeing how much win-loss record parity there is in the major leagues, how many teams are close to or at 500 and how many teams can kind of feel like they're one good run away, it makes it hard to see a lot of teams being sellers, and therefore it's hard to, imagine the high-end starting pitcher is going to get out. And I'll throw one other caveat in there, Mark, that I think is relatively unique to this season and says a lot about what this season is, which is this has been a season where pitching has dominated. The batting average is down a pretty significant amount from previous seasons. Run scoring is down, etc., across the board. And I think that's because, among other reasons, there's a lot of contributing factors. There is better young starting pitching across the board than in any other time, which means that the best pitching is young, generally inexpensive, and controllable. Even non-contenders tend not to trade that type of pitcher. You end up trading the guy who's going to be a free agent like Cliff Lee or is making a ton of money like Dan Harron and Roy Oswalt. The fact that the better starting pitchers are the older starting pitchers, to me, suggests that you're not going to see the best of the guys get out into the marketplace this July.
All right, that was Joel Sherman. You can read Joel all the time on nypost.com. You can also follow him on Twitter at Joel Sherman1. And we'll talk to Joel more and as the rest of the season goes on all the time about the Mets, Yankees, and of course leading up to the trade deadline on July 31st. The New York Post, I'm Mark Hale.